Today we're having a talk on social justice in the city, measuring and addressing food security and poverty in Lethbridge. And Dr. Trina Filan is an assistant professor of women and gender studies and in the Faculty of Arts and Science. And Mary Nugent is a nursing instructor in the Faculty of Health Sciences. Dr. Canon Erin Phillips is chaplain in Ecumenical campus ministry in Incumbent in the Anglican Church Ascension in Coaldale. And Dr. John Usher is president of the UofL Faculty Association, professor in the Faculty of Management, and president of the food bank, the Lethbridge Food Bank, and also Apprentice Institute affiliate. So we're going to start off with Dr. Trina Filan speaking. So I'll give you just a little bit more background on her bio. Dr. Filan is a feminist geographer with an abiding interest in the way power and identity shape human interactions with non-human natural environments. Her particular interest is in how these interactions take shape within agricultural systems. And I see I'm still wearing my name tag from my previous event. I'll take that off. Dr. Filan is, as I mentioned, in the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and she teaches classes both here and in the Department of Geography. And for the last 18 months, she's been investigating the complexion and construction of power and invisibility in Lethbridge food systems. So over to you. Thank you.
Hi, folks. So I'm Dr. Trina Filan, and all of those things they sound so silly and pretentious now that I've heard them said back. Really? I wrote all of that nonsense? But you know, you gotta liven it up a little bit, I suppose, in your bio. So, yes, I'm going to start off this talk. I'm going to be talking about a process that's been going on in Lethbridge for the last, well, it's been going on for about 3 years, but I've been involved with it for about 18 months. There's a process called the Vibrant Lethbridge community process. And Vibrant Lethbridge is an offshoot of Vibrant Communities Canada, which is a way to get communities to think about how they can address poverty at the local level instead of having sort of a best practices kit for addressing poverty. How do you understand what's going on in your town and then make the use of the resources that are available to you? So Vibrant Lethbridge last October, 2 Octobers ago actually, said, we'd like to know how people who actually experience poverty here in the city, how they fell into it, the barriers they see to getting out of it, and the solutions they see to poverty in the city. And so what we did, a group of volunteers got together and we created a focus group research project. And we also did some individual interviews. And what we thought was, well, we have all of these statistics, but statistics don't really tell you the lived experience story of what it's like to have to dwell daily in poverty and the expectations at multiple levels that are put upon you for you to get out. So we decided we'll take the statistics, but we'll also look at the lived experience. Ultimately, we decided, based on all of the people who are involved in this Vibrant Lethbridge committee, they're mostly people from community organizations, the city, the university, volunteers who are interested in alleviating poverty. We decided there were some target populations to talk to. So we looked at single parents, mothers in crisis, immigrants, Aboriginal people, senior citizens, youth over the age of 18, because it's really complicated to talk to kids, although that would be an excellent thing also to do, and people with disabilities. And during this whole process, we wanted to get people to, be assured that this wasn't just a, hey, tell us what's going on in your lives sort of thing, but a, hey, we'd like to actually do something about this. So we were going for trust building and the idea of reciprocity, that eventually this information will be of use and benefit to the people who participated. The most important thing that we need to recognize when we're thinking about these issues is that poverty doesn't just affect a small segment of the population. All of us are vulnerable to poverty. I'm sure that the people in High River were not expecting to lose everything, right? And so all of a sudden they're experiencing poverty, loss of material resources, a loss of community resources, and how many of those people now are at risk of remaining in that situation because systems aren't set up to support them, to help them out, okay? So we are all vulnerable. So during this focus group research, we did 8 focus groups, we did 2 individual interviews, and then we compiled a list of common themes. And so I'm going to just talk about the themes that really emerged and give you some indicative quotes so that you can sense where the people in the groups are coming from. One of the common themes was the cyclical intergenerational nature of poverty and the feeling that it is inescapable at some level. So here is one of the quotes. Poverty is you've got the weight of society pushing you down, and you're way down there, and it's kind of hard to go back up because you're trying to go up a waterfall, right? So it's very difficult, and once you're impoverished, it's very hard to get out. It's like the mafia. You never get out, right? So there's this feeling of inescapability, very difficult to emerge from poverty. And while it's not totally insurmountable, the challenges for getting out, existing support systems aren't really adequate to address the multiple and simultaneous challenges that people in poverty experience. It's not just that you can't pay the rent. It's also that you have to take care of kids. You have to figure out whether to pay your electric bill. What about the medicines? How are we going to get to jobs? How do I keep a full-time job and do all of these things? So sometimes you've got to decide between going, all right, do I pay my full electric bill, or do I make sure I have enough food for the month for my family? So there are all of these choices that have to be made. And there was actually some research published last year in the journal Science about how poverty actually impacts people's decision-making abilities. So if you're preoccupied with trying to figure out how to supply the basics in your life, then having a long-term plan for escaping poverty is actually not feasible. Your brain cannot do this and that. And that's a human condition, okay? So another theme that came up was the idea that poverty is not just about material resources. It's about emotional poverty and the incumbent mental health issues that result. So there's loneliness and disconnection from meaningful relationships. There's loss of self-esteem. There's the desire to be useful, to be seen as a contributing member to your society, but often contribution is seen in terms of, can you do a full-time job? And lots of people cannot hold down full-time jobs, or there are impediments to doing that. And so there are all of these issues, and then there's the interconnection of fear and stress and depression that can compound into creating ill health both at the mental and the physical level. So here's a quote. I remember staying up at night before I left my ex, and we were behind in rent and bills were unpaid. They were shutting off my electricity every week, and I would go back in and beg them to turn it on because I had a brand new baby at the house. And I would just lay in bed at night and just, what am I gonna do? Like, what am I supposed to do? There's nothing I can do. My parents won't help me, friends won't help me anymore, social services won't help me. I had nothing, and I had absolutely nothing. To live like that for so long, it was terrifying. So there's a lot of pressure on people who are living in poverty, including the stigma of being in poverty. So that's not something that most of us see as a valuable category to dwell in, right? There's a lot of stigma around poverty. And it's not all, some of it is based on not just this idea of income and emotional poverty, but we have all these intersecting identities. So there are lots of people who immigrated here from countries where they used to have lots of support. They were considered valuable members of their community, but because of the conditions of immigration here, they don't own land, they're not the valued members of their family anymore, so there's a loss of prestige in their families. There's also a lot of racism that has to be contended with. So, being treated, because of how you're being treated, the poorness that comes along with it, unable to work yourself out of being native. I can never change into a white person and be successful. So there's a lot of that experience that goes into creating the conditions that maintain poverty. And there are also structural support and systemic failures. Lots of systems work to help people up to a point. But then, if those people start to emerge from poverty, maybe they're gaining some English language skills so that they can finally start to be in the work world, or maybe they're starting to kick their addiction. But once you start getting to a certain point of success, the system often breaks down. There's support for this extreme part, but not the middle. What happens in the middle when you're just starting to get your feet on the ground? And a lot of times people feel abandoned by the systems that they have come to rely on. So I'm learning how to hate. I hate the social workers I have to deal with. I hate all these people that keep telling me to go do this, go do that, get this sign, bring it to that person. And all the time you go to these people, they're never there. They're in meetings, or they're out of town, or they're on vacation. I don't understand. It's really upsetting to me. It's very frustrating. They'll tear you down, but they won't help you up. So there are a lot of overlapping and intersecting themes that we can see here. There's one of these themes does not exist without all of the others, right? But while this sounds kind of dire, a lot of these folks know what would help them. They have solutions. They're in poverty, and they know what they need to do to dwell day to day, and also they can see that there's this possibility of getting out, but it seems unattainable. So what are some of the solutions that they suggested? There are educational and vocational opportunities, including life skills training and addictions counseling, and the chance to volunteer to gain work skills. Because a lot of people say they don't have a particular skill, but there are perhaps avenues for acquiring those skills. There's also the idea that people in poverty are experts at particular things. There are some people who are really whizzes at budgeting. There are people who know how to make healthy meals that stretch a small amount of food a long way. So the idea of tapping into their expertise and having a way for those folks to feel empowered and important, that their knowledge matters, so that they're not just the slob on the street, right? So here's an indicative quote. Even people with poverty, they have talents, whether it's a hidden talent, whether it's their work talent or whatever. I just wonder if there's a way to play, or if there's a place around where you can take that. Say you paint. Some people play music in that, where you can go and show off to a community forum so that you're not just a lazy, idle bum on the street. I just have one more. And then they recognize that there are these systemic failures and gaps that need to be addressed. There's a lot that this community can do to begin changing these conditions. I think what they have to do is really work with all the different organizations here. Have an in-depth look at exactly what they're doing. How can these organizations be effective? And in fact, that is the next step that Vibrant Lethbridge is taking, getting community groups that provide services together to see how these gaps can be addressed. And so that is where Vibrant Lethbridge is at the moment, and that's all I've got to say on that. So, that leads into trouble, right?
All right.
Thank you, Trina. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. John Usher. He's president of the University Faculty Association, and I think probably talking about his work with as president of the Lethbridge Food Bank as well. His area of research is in organizational theory and strategy, and he works in the Faculty of Management. And he has interest in emergent self-organization, organizational ecology, and transdisciplinary. I can't say it. Transdisciplinarity. There we go.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Sharon. All right. I'm going to stand up because I have to kind of wander around a bit, or I won't think right. So thank you. So this is partly about a journey that the Lethbridge Food Bank has taken over the course of the last year. There's a distinction that often gets made with respect to poverty, that there are actions and processes that can be taken to reduce poverty, and also actions that simply alleviate poverty. And as food banks, we're mostly in the alleviation business. What we wanted to do is to move past that. And so what you'll see here is kind of some soul searching about how can you actually do that? What is there more that food banks can do in order to not just simply kind of help out people who are in a kind of an emergency food supply situation? So hence the topic, filling a need or a slow death of the soul. These are, so this presentation starts with numbers instead of ending with numbers. So we have some stats here, Canada, Alberta, and then Lethbridge. And the Lethbridge figures are basically the addition of the Lethbridge Food Bank and the Interfaith Food Bank. We probably have about the same, so if you wanted to do an individual of those two, you could cut it in half. But if you look, for example, at the trends across time, there are some interesting things that haven't changed, but there are some disturbing trends as well. So if you look, for example, at the trends over here with respect to the number of children that are served, you can see across time, at least from 2009 forward to 2013, that it's relatively stable. On the other hand, both the Aboriginal population and seniors are increasing at kind of a drastic rate. So we're concerned about that and trying to come to terms at a much more global level with the kinds of things that we've been doing with Vibrant Lethbridge about how to address that. Some other things to examine are, for example, the reporting employment income. So if you think that there's a problem with the working poor, the stats certainly show it up. This is not just people that don't have a job and need some food. These are people that are actually working and still need food. So we have some concerns with that one. All right, let me move forward. I mean, you can look at the numbers overall across Canada and the number of people that we serve on a regular basis, and it really is pretty staggering. All right, so one solution to this is to just simply get better at doing what it is that we do, right? So this is an example from Clark County in Washington State, and so let's take on food banks as a business and let's get really good at it and become the superstore of food banks. That's possible. I mean, you can do that. You can really get to town. $4.8 million, 22,000 square foot building. Just crank those people through. Well, maybe not. There's more to it, though. And the Food Banks 2.0 piece does involve some additional pieces. Now, see again, we've got fairly substantial staffing going on in order to run this kind of an operation. But there are also some other pieces which are nice to see. So this particular one has a heritage farm where there's some food that's being grown, and a real attempt to try to bring in other volunteers and not just sort of people that show up and say, I'd like to work for the food bank, but actually connecting to institutions that are providing opportunities for people to do internships. Okay, lots of partnerships, and trying to again bring in other pieces like the nutritional and cooking educators from Washington State, and community volunteers, so that as we kind of draw out into a broader model of what food banks can do, we can start to see how some of these pieces are going to come forward. Hey, the slow death of the soul is something which Nick Saul, who is one of the founders of the Stop in Toronto, which is sort of a food bank that went through this journey themselves, and he's become kind of the spokesperson at a global level, is now talking to folks in the UK, because unlike most of what goes on in Europe, they're actually behind us with respect to food banks. And so Nick is over there saying, don't go there. This is something that you might want to revisit, particularly with respect to the role of government as it relates to social services. So, quote from him, the only person charity food is not benefiting is the person who this was set up to help. And when you kind of look at what goes on and all the different players and stakeholders in a food bank, you'll see that there's a number of people who are, it's kind of a conscience washing station for them. There are a lot of the food that we get is food that basically big food companies don't really need, and so they're giving it to us, and they're feeling good about that. God forbid they should actually put it on the shelves and prices would go down. So there are, there's, you look behind the screen, and there are reasons why food banks continue to operate that aren't just about the need for them in terms of the people. There are also some concerns around food banks that good intentions don't always translate into good outcomes. Some are really pretty inefficient, unreliable, and the kind of food, if you just take everything that people want to give you, some of that doesn't tend to be very good kind of food. When we make up hampers for the food bank, we're very cautious about nutritional requirements, and we sort of have like a little treat bag that goes along with it, but we try not to make the whole hamper out of Doritos. 1 in 5 families suffering from food insecurity would turn to food banks, but there's a stigma. So yeah, only 1 in 5 because of the stigma, and this is what Trina was mentioning. That's another way that we want to try to deal with the food bank experience. Is there another way, rather than having people kind of eat some food? And we're experimenting perhaps with the idea that people would come and have a meal, and then you would sort of incidentally say, give them some cooking lessons, and then say, oh, incidentally, here's some food that you could actually take with you when you leave and try out this recipe at home. And so the food is sort of just the end piece instead of you came here for food. Maybe that will do something about how that will work. This is the main concern that Nick Saul has, and one that we share, is that this, like income tax, was once an emergency measure. But government has become very happy with it because it kind of takes up some slack that they might otherwise be responsible for. And so the idea that food is now, the food drives, the food banks, it's really all taken over what rightfully, in some people's minds, is a responsibility of government to say, here's some people that have kind of fallen off the path. Where's the safety net? Why does the safety net now have to be handled by this collection of organizations instead of by government? Okay, so bring the issue of food poverty back to the government. Community food centers is what became of the Stop, which was in Toronto, and this is kind of the new model in Canada of what a food bank should look like. 3 pieces. The emergency food piece is still there, but also food skills and nutrition, and finally a social justice, systemic change, and advocacy piece. And so the 3 legs of the community food center are those. So, again, not just grab the food and run, but more than that, right? And particularly with respect to what we found in the focus groups was that there's learning across people when they get together and they share. One of the greatest parts of the focus groups I found was that just the people that were in the room together, you could hear the kind of the cross-pollination of ideas and ways of accessing the system. So come in and talk to other people, combat social isolation, because that's again something that we know is a problem with respect to poverty, learn how to cook, but also build community capacity and resilience, because that's really what we want to do, is deal with this at a higher level than just simply individual people that have emergency food needs. The second part, the healthy food piece, the Interfaith Food Bank in town has not really a community garden, but a demonstration garden, but at least, and there are other folks in the Chinook Food Connect that a number of us in the room are also affiliated with, which is trying to get into urban agriculture and all the other pieces of food security that are going in the right direction. And another good piece of this, again, is that this stuff is not just for poor people. Everybody needs good nutrition. Everybody should be eating locally. And so it enfolds the poor with everybody else. So some recommendations for individuals and for businesses and for government. And you'll see that there are common themes, because some of this stuff is both supply and demand. It's chickens and eggs. Right, so lend a hand, give a boost to a family that you know, so being forward about it as an individual, contribute your time. I put on my par that this is the work that I do, which is local and meaningful, as opposed to publishing articles about transdisciplinarity. Talk about hunger with your friends, family, co-workers. It's one of those, let's get it out on the surface, let's talk about it. And this one is a big one, you'll see this all the way through. Patronize businesses that provide at least a living wage. So a lot of these people that are now coming to us have jobs. They have 2 jobs, they have 3 jobs, and they still are not making it, because, particularly in Lethbridge, here, we're mostly about franchise this and branch office that, and all of these things have staffing and wage decisions made somewhere else, and so they all say, well, no, we can't change that. That's head office or whatever. But and this has to come, this is one of those chicken and egg things. If we can get some local businesses to say, hey, we pay our people a living wage, so if you want to buy X from us, whether it's a meal or something that you need, come here and do that. And let's get that momentum rolling. For businesses, so contribute with financial support, encourage your people to volunteer. Trina mentioned this too about volunteering, but also learning opportunities. So even if the jobs are crappy jobs, let's emphasize that you can learn some stuff doing this, and try to emphasize training that goes along with it. And then, of course, it's up to business to be the other side of this living wage piece. We can't patronize them if they don't exist. So that's important. And then finally, for governments, we know that there are a number of factors that are simply critical. And they're all intermingled, right? So affordable housing, so you don't need to choose between paying the rent or feeding your children. Increasing provincial social assistance, which is really what we want to be a better Alberta along those kinds of ways. And is there a way to work with municipal government to increase the number of jobs that actually do provide a living wage? So that's that. Thank you.
I'm just going to introduce Mary while she's getting her slides ready here. So Mary Nugent has taught in community health nursing at the UofL in the NISA program for a number of years, and prior to that she worked as a nurse practitioner in rural Alberta and northern Canadian outposts for 17 years. Her master's research led her to better understand food insecurity issues in post-secondary students, and so she was looking at issues here at the UofL. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you. So kind of scripted because I tend to talk too much. But the nice thing is that there's been some overlap, so that actually works to my advantage. What I want you to understand today is how food insecurity appears to be manifested in post-secondary students. It's a very understudied population. I searched sort of high and low for literature. There really isn't much out there, and there certainly isn't much in terms of qualitative work, which is where my master's work went. And this talk today is from results from 1-hour interviews with 15 students who access the UofL food bank here on campus. And that was between October 2010 and April 2011. And it took me that long, from October to April, to actually talk to 15 students, because this is a very sensitive topic for people to actually talk about personally. So to recruit those students, it was actually quite difficult. My primary research question was asked about experiences of food security, barriers, and strategies to overcome them. So very similar to what to the work that you did. The definition I went with in terms of food security was from the FAO, and it was: food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and daily life. And food insecurity was really defined as, or is linked with inadequate nutrition and variety of health and a variety of health issues. So I think I'm quoting the same study as you, but I thought it was 1 in 4 people that that 1 in 4 people that are hungry access the food bank. So what's going on with those other 3? And so that's actually a question that we need to ask as well. And this study was done in 2001, I believe, and nothing has been done since. And so we need to actually be looking at that as well. Most post-secondary institutions now actually have food banks, and it's really to meet a need that they have found. But it is really, for the sake of the students that are here today, a very downstream approach, or a very sort of, an approach that really what we need to be looking at is increased funds, increased minimum wage, livable places that are cost efficient. So now, you're going to be talking about the rest of this. I'm not going to go too far, except for to say that the U of A has been going great guns in their food banks, and so is the University of Ottawa, seeing over 1,000% in a few years increase in the use of food banks. Now, of course, you guys all live here, so I don't have to explain much about this, except that if you've never heard sort of the terminology food desert, that's actually essentially the university lives in. It's a food desert. And meaning that it's sort of the typical fast food, liquor-based types of, I'm curious, liquor-based types of businesses, and there's really not a great place to get adequate food. And even if you're on campus here, it actually tends to be fairly pricey to get the most nutritious food, and so people tend to opt for the less nutritious. Actually, food swamp is another way actually to describe this as well, and I didn't actually come up with that term. That's actually out there as well. And you guys know that this map is a bit outdated, but what I wanted to get across is that there's 3.4 kilometers to the nearest full grocery store, and I was all excited because there was a second grocery store going in. Guess where it got located? Like a few yards from the first one. Okay, so demographics of the 15 students that I interviewed. 2/3 of them were female. 5 of them were Aboriginal, which seemed like an overrepresentation because university-wide, 5% of students declare themselves as First Nation status. Majority lived off campus, common law, had kids. 2/3 lived on the west side of Lethbridge near the university. I used thematic analysis, and essentially the themes were student as person. So what's going on in that person's life? The vulnerabilities of the student, which then led them towards the food bank, structural and organizational factors that affected the students, and then reflections on maturing and persevering, because unlike perhaps some of the people that you've been studying, students generally have hope because they are on a pathway to get to a better place in terms of their economic status. So the main points today are going to be that the student is complex. Oops, hang on a sec. That the student is complex, and each student has a unique story. Students do have strategies to select and procure food, similar to other food insecure populations. That food insecure students experience suffering because of being food insecure, and so do their families. And there's 3 pathways leading to food bank use, which would be useful in terms of looking at interventions. And finally, that the post-secondary student population is not well studied in this area. So, this is Grace. It's always bad, like being a student. I just don't have enough for a whole month. I won't pay my light bill one month, my daycare another month, so that I can buy food for my children. And the weather was bad, and I was sick, and the added expense of gas and heat. I just needed food. So what I found was students' lives were really complex. Each really were unique, but what was in common that they held multiple roles and responsibilities. They were learners. They're also parents and children, employees, and individuals. And students like Grace struggled with these overlapping roles. Other student contexts that came up and that the students were juggling were pregnancy and breastfeeding, temporary separations from spouse, marital strife, illness, personal illness, illness of child, parents' sudden financial downturn, which was actually interesting. There was more than one student in my study with their parents suffering, therefore it kind of flowed downhill. Limited parental support, previous substance abuse, recent immigration, and the list just kind of goes on and on. These undermine the students' ability to be able to juggle their personal context and their ability to maintain food security for themselves and their families. So, planning is in the nature of being a student. The challenge is making it last until the next money comes. After being paid, I'm probably left with $5 or $10. Then I use a credit card, whichever one can take the hit. So participants budgeted, they juggled their funds, and they tried to procure food from the least expensive places. They're scouting for deals, they buy damaged and expired goods, they prioritized healthy food choices, but they felt guilty for small indulgences like a little ice cream or perhaps a chocolate bar. They maintain food security systems. They have pantry to store their sale items and meal stretchers like macaroni and rice. They have support systems like friends and family, churches, food banks, but those supports really failed them at times. Students actually do value their health, but their finances were lacking to maintain the nutrition, adequate nutrition that they needed. And they were vigilant in terms of having overall spending plans, using flyers, shopping at secondhand stores, knowing which stores were the least expensive. I actually had a conversation with my students today about which are the least expensive stores in town. They know this stuff. Students also suffered physically and emotionally. There are mornings where I haven't eaten, I'm walking around on fumes. This led to a number of health issues such as stress, exhaustion, sleep issues, and weight loss and headaches. For us, it's the ability to feed our children first and then us second. One participant reported a 60-pound weight loss because of choosing to feed her children instead of feeding herself while trying to keep up with her studies. Students were embarrassed to use the food bank. They worried and feared for their shelter, their health, their children. They experienced marital strain, had impossible dilemmas as to who would be fed first in the family, taking a part-time job, but thereby risking their marks or leaving university altogether. One worried participant was worried that child welfare would come and apprehend her children. We categorized the students into 3 pathways. And as I said, these are actually quite useful if you want to actually look at interventions for actually anybody who is food insecure and who end up in the pathway towards the food bank. So the shortfall pathway was characterized by chronic and worsening lack of funds each month or semester. So those that are receiving scholarships, such as Aboriginal students, master's students, they tend to fall in this category. There was never enough each month and it just got worse and worse. Cumulative pathway was a series of expenditures which on their own wouldn't be an issue, but when added together, created a situation where the students didn't have enough money to last for the semester. And I'm sure all of us actually have had this happen, where you think you've got X amount of dollars, and then there's medications and treatments and reading glasses and having a baby and car repairs and moving apartments and new damage deposits. All those things actually added up to not having enough money for the semester. The catastrophic pathway came from people who had expected money, but it didn't, for some reason, show up. And that could have been through a delayed or decreased student loan or a parental job or business loss or their own summer job loss. So there were a number of structures that also factored into that the students really had not a lot of control over. and it directly or indirectly affected their food security. And a lot of these were basically policy or business driven by an organization or government, leaving, okay, I already said that. The costs and quality of housing and the pricing of techs were both issues. I have a toaster oven, a microwave, a mini fridge, and I pay $325 a month. That's pretty difficult to do on a month-to-month basis. Many had unexpected costs like beyond tuition, such as laptop computer purchases to keep up with class expectations or paying for school trips, costs of copying, printing, and I know in nursing we've been guilty about having huge poster displays which have cost students upwards of $200, so are they actually purchasing a mark? Right. Participants also described low quality and high cost of eating at the university, distances from home to affordable grocery stores. A lot of them knew that the superstore was one of the cheapest places in town, but they couldn't get there because they're living on the west side. They had no way to get there. And we know that Lethbridge is a hard place to be without a vehicle. I paid $2 for a little thing of yogurt. I can go to Safeway and buy 12 of them for $4.99. So the pricing on campus is kind of tough. Student loan limits, monthly scholarship rates were also issues. One student said that I'm getting almost the same amount of money for student loans as I did back in 2000 because she was a student previously. Then I was able to spend $100 a month on groceries. Now $100 doesn't buy much anymore. So those of us who have been students, we talk about sort of our starving student days. And is it actually a rite of passage or not? Is it a normal part of the student experience? So students in my study were not the stereotypical students. In fact, Lululemon and Starbucks coffees and stuff like that. Yeah, they may have the occasional treat or someone has given them a gift. But overall, they were vigilant budgeters. They buy generic, dented, outdated foods to survive. So another thing is we think, okay, well maybe the parents should be paying for this. Well, a third of students in studies, a third of students rely on summer or current employment, or government loans or bursaries, or university scholarship, which accounts for 56% of overall student debt. Average debt of a baccalaureate and master's grads, 37, I believe it's like 38 or 39 now. This is a little bit old. Without government assistance, 42% of students would have quit school entirely. Family financial contributions drop over time, and they drop by 16% from year 1 to year 3. Females are more likely to borrow from government than from family and private institutions. They're more likely to work part-time, and we know that females tend to earn 25% less money in the summer than their male counterparts. 60% of students employed during the school year work 18 hours a week or more, and we also, after 18 hours, they also report negative impacts. Okay. So we're at 10 minutes, and that's actually fine because essentially what they're saying here is that it's going to be better. It's going to be, when I graduate, I'll be able to get a job and things will be better. So they always had hope, which is actually a really interesting piece of this. Essentially, they have the same 5 barriers that everyone else does in terms of food security, which is money, time, geography, transportation, and people, using too much electricity, perhaps eating food where they shouldn't have out of the cupboard. And the students identified that there are a number of policies that could be corrected, things like student loans, scholarships, improving city transportation, and educating students in their budgeting and nutrition. And I think this is my last slide. Essentially, there's prevalence. There's very little studies out here. All I could find was prevalence in 3 actually very new studies. 45% at the University of Hawaii, prevalence of food insecurity. 39% at the City University of New York. And a brand new study that's out this year, 59% of the students studied in Oregon. So basically, students are unique. They are similar to other populations. They experience suffering. They contribute, structural and organizational issues do contribute to student security. There are some pathways that could help illuminate the issues, and students are essentially understudied. And that's it.
And our last panelist is Chaplain Erin Phillips, She's currently a chaplain for University of Lethbridge and Lethbridge College for 19 years, as well as serving as a parish priest at the Anglican Church in Coaldale. And she's also a sessional instructor at the university. A central aspect of her work on campus is addressing issues of food security for post-secondary students.
Sure. Thanks. Before I became chaplain 19 years ago, I taught here, and before that I taught in the States, and before that I taught in Ontario. And students would tell you their problems, roommates, parents, juggling jobs and classes, things like that. When I became chaplain, a whole world opened up to me as students started to come and share very different kinds of problems. In many ways, the same kinds of issues that we identified with the Vibrant Lethbridge study that we've just done. Housing, transportation, and food. What I discovered was that the students who were most susceptible to it are actually the same folks we found in Vibrant Lethbridge were susceptible. So if students were older, if they had kids, if they were Aboriginal or an international student, they were more likely to have these problems for a variety of reasons. Lack of family support, just greater responsibilities financially in terms of looking after children and the rest, lack of family connections or community support if they're new to the community, racism, and then the fact that until fairly recently, the housing stock of Lethbridge was really limited. Vacancy rates for most of the last 20 years have sort of hovered below 1%. They've gone up significantly. The city actually has done some very effective things in terms of addressing some of the housing issues. It has gotten better. It's still not great. And if you are part of a visible minority, it still tends to be bad because you have to deal with racism issues in the city. I mean, at least this is certainly the reports we get. What shocked me was the students who you wouldn't have thought were struggling, who were struggling. So students who, 19 years old, parents in Calgary, you would think would actually have lots of support, actually not having support. And so we started to address the issues, particularly around food, by feeding students. So at the college, at the end of each term, we do a big supper. We feed about 400 students, a sit-down, hot meal. It's really lovely. But numerous times I've had volunteers come to me really upset because they've just been talking to a student who hasn't eaten in days. The worst was a case where a family had come. They hadn't eaten in 5 days. So these are 3 little kids under the age of 8. But of course, these students often don't want to ask for help because they're afraid of child welfare getting involved. So this family had been going without food. And I mean, we're fortunate because the volunteer they told us just adopted them basically and fed them for the rest of the year. I mean, this just became sort of their family project, was making sure that these kids ate every day and ate decently. But we know that there are students who are not so fortunate, who are just going hungry. So one faculty member was telling me she had a student come and sit in her office and they're talking, and the student can't take her eyes off of the apple that's sitting on her desk. The prof's already taken a bite out of it when the students arrived, and finally the student says, "Can I have that apple? I'm so hungry." Bite out of it and all. I had other faculty and staff telling me that they basically were giving their lunch away every day to students who would come, who were sitting there, you can hear the stomach grumbling, right? So they're just passing over. So we started creating little food catches, places where we knew it was strategic to just leave food that they could hand out. So nuts, jerky, or protein things, fruit cups, those kinds of things, non-perishable things that people could just keep stashed and hand out. Now I started telling faculty this who were absolutely shocked, had no idea. But if you talk to counseling, they'll tell you, oh, this is really common. They've got students coming in who are struggling and now dealing with anxiety and depression and problems with sleep because they can't do well in their classes. But partly they're not doing well in their classes because they're so hungry that they can't focus, or they're just feeling awful because their diet is lots of carbs. So here at the university, we hand out bags of groceries. We do it at the end of each term. We started this 12 years ago, and basically all the churches in southern Alberta, we collect food from them and started handing it out. Well, the day we were going to hand it out last December was the day of the blizzard. So I started getting phone calls and emails from students, what's happening? I don't want to miss it. And I thought, okay, now this to me is a sign that this isn't just sort of a fun thing, you know, an early Christmas gift, but this is actually a critical resource for helping students survive to the end of term. And I've had students say this. One student was so excited. She said, I've eaten Itchy Band every day for a month. There's real food in here. Really excited because of this. Or another student said, that's how I got through my exams. It was the only groceries I had for my last 2 weeks. And this is about $20. I mean, they're nice bags, but they're not extravagant. They're not huge. But they'll sort of carry you through that last little bit. So those are sort of two of the big things we started doing on our 2 campuses to try and address some of this need. We've been trying to support the food banks. It's interesting, though, to look at the statistics for food. Mary did a quantitative study of hunger, so 2008, I think.
Yes.
15.4% of students reported going hungry in the 3 months prior. So that's about 1,000 students at the UofL who've missed at least one meal, some of them missing a meal every day, reporting being hungry 20 times in a month. So 1,000 students, but the food bank is handing out roughly 250 hampers a year. So we know that there are lots of students who are going hungry who are not accessing the food bank, largely, I think, because of the issues of stigma. The interesting thing about the stats is when you look at them, the college food bank, they hand out 100 hampers a year, roughly. And it's been pretty steady. 2/3 of those are to families. So at least 2 in the family. Last year, the biggest family was a family of 8 who were receiving hampers. The university last year, now I don't have this past year's stats, but the year before it was 254 hampers. Now there are roughly 2 times as many students here, but that's more than 2 times as many hampers. But 2/3 of the hampers are going to single students. So we're seeing some interesting differences in demographics of who's accessing the food bank here and at the college. But we also know it's underrepresenting the numbers of students who are hungry. The Health Center in 2009 did their own survey and found 20% of students were reporting going hungry in the 6 months prior, and they also identified 44% are not getting adequate fruits and vegetables. So part of the issue of food security is the lack of healthy food. We're trying to do some things. You know, John pointed to a really difficult issue, and that's the problem of, do you just alleviate or do you actually try and change what's going on? A lot of what I'm trying to do is just alleviate it, because we're quite convinced that if we can just get students through and then get their education, that things will probably improve. That education is probably the single most important factor for getting out of poverty. So a big part of what I'm doing is just trying to get students through. So with financial help occasionally, but with food help and the rest. But there are bigger issues, like why are so many students hungry? And that's actually, I got connected to these folks through that and got involved with Vibrant Lethbridge and with Chinook Food Connect, because I wanted to talk about some of those bigger issues. Because what I'm finding is in most of our congregations, I go out and I talk about this, people are stunned because of the stereotype of wealthy students who spend all their money on beer and pizza and ski trips. And the fact that most folks actually have no clue of what kinds of issues of poverty there are on campus. But I'm not surprised by that, because most of the faculty I've talked to had no idea. And most of the students I've talked to about it will not tell their friends about it either. So it's a really hidden problem on our campuses. There's some exciting things happening. One of the faculty made a significant donation to the university to address food security. And we've been using that money. We have a committee, Food for Thought, that's looking at how to use this money to fund projects on campus. So for instance, there's a community garden on campus where they're going to be planting this year a fruit garden, fruit trees, and we're providing the money to pay for the trees. There's also, I don't know how many of you have been to it, but there's been farmers markets now on campus, and that's being funded. It's someone's initiative that we're funding to try and improve access to healthy food and local food on campus. And Aramark, since they've come on side last year, have also been interested in helping us try and address some of these issues. So for the first time we did Christmas hampers for students we had found out about, we were concerned about, and Aramark and the chaplaincy partnered, and we did that. They'll be helping us with our food drive in March. So we'll be handing out groceries again in March. So we're trying to form some partnerships. Part of what I've discovered in the last few years is that there's all sorts of little things happening, pockets of things happening on campus and even in the community that people aren't aware of. And so we're trying to actually get to better connected so that we're not conflicting or overlapping, but we're actually working more effectively together, as well as being more public about it so that we can raise awareness, so we can start addressing some of the issues of why students are in poverty in the first place. So that's what we're about. That's why I get to work with these awesome folks. So, thank you.